John Stone never thought a single coin could change his life. A millionaire with everything he could ever want, money, power, a luxurious home, John was accustomed to being in control. But on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, as he walked down a busy city street, a ragged beggar with a glint of quiet wisdom in his eyes handed him a worn coin, without saying a word. John, amused and slightly irritated, took the coin. After all, what could this man possibly have to offer him? Yet, the moment his fingers closed around the small, cold metal, something shifted deep within him. It was just a coin, but for reasons he couldn't explain, John couldn't stop thinking about it. That moment, that simple act, would unravel the life he'd spent years building, leading him to a journey he could never have predicted. John Stone had it all: wealth, power, and a mansion that stretched across an entire city block. The name Stone Enterprises was synonymous with success, and for most of his life, he had been the one making decisions, the one with the answers, the one who could buy anything he desired. At 48, he had carved out an empire that few dared to rival. Yet, despite his accolades, despite the opulent lifestyle, and despite the endless accolades he received from colleagues and business partners alike, John felt a gnawing emptiness inside, a hunger he couldn't satisfy with money, and a thirst he couldn't quench with anything his wealth could buy. It wasn't that he was unhappy, at least not in the conventional sense. He had everything that most people dream of: a mansion on the hills with sweeping views of the city below, luxury cars parked in his 5-car garage, a yacht docked at the marina, and a life filled with extravagant dinners and international trips. His friends were the elite, his business associates were some of the most influential names in the corporate world, and his every need was met with the snap of a finger. But the loneliness was constant. Every time he sat down to a lavish meal, he was surrounded by people who didn't really know him. They weren't there to understand him or share a moment of vulnerability, they were there because of his success, because of what he could provide. And deep down, John knew it. He had spent decades building his empire, but in doing so, he had unknowingly built walls around himself. He had forgotten what it was like to truly connect with people, to laugh without a facade, to have a real conversation that wasn't about business or profit margins. In his office, the walls were lined with books, but most were untouched. He had everything he could possibly need, except for one thing: peace. Peace with himself. Peace with the choices he had made. And peace with the fact that, despite all his wealth, something was always missing. This wasn't something John openly admitted, not even to himself. Instead, he buried the feeling under layers of work, distraction, and endless meetings. Every morning, he woke up to a flurry of emails, calls, and texts. The world needed him, he told himself. People relied on him to make the right decisions. He was a leader, a businessman, he had a reputation to uphold. His identity had become so intertwined with his wealth and success that he couldn't imagine a life without them. He often found himself reflecting on his childhood, remembering a time when life had been simpler. When his parents were still alive, when he had spent hours playing soccer in the backyard with his friends. Back then, the world had felt wide open, full of potential and possibility. But now, as he looked around at his luxurious surroundings, he realized how small his world had become. The grandeur of his mansion, with its polished marble floors and towering chandeliers, felt more like a gilded cage than a home. The silence in his vast living room echoed back at him like a reminder of his isolation. He couldn't even remember the last time he had hosted a dinner where he truly enjoyed himself, when the laughter had been genuine, when people had come for the company, not the prestige of being at his table. Even his own employees had become faceless names to him. He paid them well, but he didn't know what any of them truly cared about. He was a man with everything, but nothing that mattered. On this particular afternoon, as he sat at his desk overlooking the city skyline, the weight of this realization pressed down on him more than usual. The view of the bustling city below felt distant, like he was watching life through a glass window, removed from it all. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the thoughts, but they kept coming back. The constant hum of his phone notifications, the emails piling up, the meetings waiting for him, all of it felt meaningless. He sighed and closed his laptop. Maybe a walk outside would clear his mind. He stood up and slipped on his coat. Outside, the city streets were just as chaotic as they always were, horns honking, people rushing past with their heads down, lost in their own world. No one had time to look at anyone else, let alone stop and ask how they were doing. It was just another day in the fast-paced world John had come to know so well. As he walked down the busy sidewalk, lost in his thoughts, he passed by a street corner he had never noticed before. There, sitting on the curb, was a beggar, ragged, with a scruffy beard and tattered clothes. His eyes, however, were striking. There was something different about them, a calmness that stood in sharp contrast to the frantic energy of the city around him. The beggar was holding a small cup in his hands, his head slightly bowed, as though waiting for someone to notice him. John felt a strange pull toward the man, but quickly shook it off. Why should I care about him? He thought. He had far more important things on his mind. But as he continued walking, something made him pause. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handful of change. He dropped a coin into the beggar's cup and kept walking. It was a simple act. A small, inconsequential gesture that John thought nothing of. But as his foot hit the next step, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. It wasn't guilt or pity, but it was a feeling that lingered. He dismissed it immediately, telling himself it was nothing. Just a passing moment. After all, what did a beggar have to offer a millionaire like him? It was a Tuesday afternoon, just like any other. The city was bustling with its usual frantic pace, the streets crowded with people hurrying to their next destination, unaware of the world outside their narrow paths. John Stone had long ago become part of this machine, moving through the motions of his high-powered life with precision. But that day, something was different, something subtle, yet undeniable. John had stepped out of his office for a brief break, needing a moment of air, though it wasn't like him to stray far from his routine. He walked along the familiar downtown street, absorbed in his thoughts, trying to push aside the gnawing sense of discontent he couldn't quite name. It wasn't a bad day, it was just a day. And yet, it felt like the weight of all his years of success, all the business deals, all the material wealth, had added up to something that now felt empty. As he walked past the busy shops, a figure on the corner of the street caught his eye. The man was sitting on the curb, his back slightly hunched, his clothes ragged and worn, but his eyes, they were what stopped John in his tracks. There was a stillness about the beggar, a calmness that contrasted with the rush of people around them. The man wasn't begging in the usual sense. He didn't shout or wave his cup in people's faces. He simply sat there, as if waiting for something, or someone, to notice him. John's eyes lingered on the beggar for a fraction of a second longer than usual, almost as though an invisible thread had pulled him in. He tried to walk past, but for some reason, his steps slowed, then stopped altogether. The beggar didn't ask for money, nor did he make any attempt to engage John directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn coin. Without saying a word, the beggar extended his hand, offering the coin to John. His gesture wasn't aggressive or demanding, it was gentle, almost deliberate, like he knew something John didn't. John blinked in surprise, confused by the unexpected offer. A beggar giving a coin to a millionaire? It didn't make sense. The roles were reversed, weren't they? Here, the beggar said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Take it. It's yours. John looked down at the coin in the beggar's hand. It was small, dull from years of use, and faded from the elements. It wasn't even shiny. For a moment, John didn't know what to do. He glanced at the man's face again, meeting his steady, unblinking gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment. Just a calm, almost knowing look that seemed to say, "This is important." A strange impulse washed over John. He reached out and took the coin, his fingers brushing against the beggar's weathered hand. The moment felt oddly significant, as though the act itself carried more weight than it should. John didn't know why, but as soon as the coin was in his palm, a shiver ran down his spine, something deep inside him stirring. The brief exchange had felt almost sacred. "Thank you," John muttered, his voice feeling out of place in the silence. He turned and walked away, not quite sure what had just happened. But the coin, he couldn't shake it. It felt heavier than it should have. It felt like a sign. John Stone couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled inside him after the encounter with the beggar. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of the beggar's calm face and the small, worn coin kept playing in his mind, over and over again. It wasn't like him to dwell on such trivial matters. He had far more important things to focus on: business deals to close, emails to answer, deadlines to meet. But the coin, it felt different. He tossed and turned, trying to fall asleep, but the quiet hum of the city outside and the persistent image of the beggar's eyes made it impossible to relax. John sat up in bed and reached over to his nightstand, his hand brushing against the cold, metal surface of the coin. For a moment, he just stared at it, holding it between his fingers. It was just a coin, a small, insignificant thing. So why did it feel so heavy? The beggar had given it to him so casually, without a word of explanation. There had been no demands, no begging. Just a simple, quiet offering. John had taken it without thinking, mostly out of habit, the way he would drop a coin into any other beggar's cup without a second thought. But this was different. He felt something shift in that brief moment, something he couldn't quite explain. John's mind raced as he considered the possibility that it wasn't about the coin at all. It wasn't the physical object that had made an impact, it was the act itself, the gesture. The beggar had given him something without asking for anything in return, as if he knew something John didn't. Was it pity? John wondered. No, it didn't feel like that. There had been no judgment in the beggar's eyes, no sympathy, just calmness. So why did it affect me like this? He turned the coin over in his hand, its edges worn smooth. He had seen coins like it before, small, unremarkable. But somehow, this one seemed more important than it should have been. More symbolic. A reminder. Of what, though? John couldn't answer that question, but the sense of unease remained, gnawing at him. As he sat there in the quiet of his room, the feeling began to grow. Something about his life, his routine, his entire way of being, suddenly felt off. It wasn't that he was unhappy, he had everything anyone could ever want. Wealth, success, power. But in that moment, as he held the coin, he felt an emptiness he hadn't been willing to admit before. The achievements that once brought him satisfaction now seemed hollow, as if they were nothing more than a distraction from something deeper. His thoughts drifted back to the beggar. What if that man had something to teach me? John mused. The idea seemed absurd, even laughable. He was a millionaire, a titan of industry. He had built his empire from the ground up. What could a beggar possibly have to offer him? Yet, deep inside, a small voice whispered, maybe everything. John couldn't dismiss it. He had spent years chasing the wrong things, building his wealth, his reputation, his status, thinking that these were the keys to fulfillment. But now, as he sat in his luxurious bed, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been chasing the wrong dream all along. With a sigh, he placed the coin back on the nightstand, but he couldn't escape the thought that it was somehow connected to a larger shift within him. Something was changing, and he didn't yet understand why. The days following his encounter with the beggar felt different to John Stone, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. It was subtle, at first, a shift so small it was almost imperceptible. But each time he touched the coin, a strange calm washed over him, and each time his fingers brushed against its worn surface, it seemed to remind him of something he had long forgotten. John had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to push away things that didn't serve his goal of success. He had built his empire by doing just that, by focusing on the numbers, the deals, and the bottom line. But in the days after he took the coin, a slow and uncomfortable awareness began to creep in. For the first time in years, John started noticing things he had long ignored, the faces of the people he passed on the street, the exhaustion in his employees' eyes, the loneliness in his own life. The coin became a quiet reminder of the simplicity he had lost in the pursuit of greatness. John didn't immediately understand its significance, but he began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. At work, he found himself listening more carefully when people spoke to him. He noticed when his assistant, Lily, looked tired after working late into the night on an important project, something he had never paid much attention to before. Normally, he would have simply brushed it off as part of the job, but now, something in him urged him to ask, "How are you doing?" The words surprised him as they left his mouth, but they also felt good, genuine. A few days later, John surprised himself again. He had never been the type to leave the office for lunch or take breaks, his schedule was always too tight. But one afternoon, as the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him, he decided to step outside. He walked down the same busy street where he had met the beggar and found himself stopping at a small park nearby, something he would have passed by without a second thought just weeks before. As he sat on a bench, watching the world go by, John allowed himself to just be. It was a foreign feeling, this stillness, this ability to exist outside of work. He wasn't thinking about his company's latest merger, or the next big pitch he had to deliver. He wasn't analyzing his financial projections or preparing for his next meeting. Instead, he simply observed, a mother pushing a stroller, an elderly man feeding pigeons, a group of teenagers laughing together. For the first time in a long time, John realized that life didn't revolve around deals and transactions. People, real human connections, mattered more than he had allowed himself to believe. It wasn't about being busy all the time, it was about being present. The next morning, as he walked into his office, John did something he hadn't done in years, he made small talk with his team. He asked them about their weekend plans. He smiled at them. He shared a laugh over a joke in the break room. The more he interacted, the more he felt a warmth he hadn't known was missing. And the more he realized that it wasn't just his employees who needed connection, it was him, too. He hadn't yet come to terms with the deeper meaning of the coin, but the changes in him were undeniable. The act of reflection had set something in motion, something that felt both new and familiar, as though he was reconnecting with a part of himself that had been buried under years of ambition and isolation. The more he embraced these small, quiet acts of reflection, listening, noticing, being present, the more he realized that success wasn't about achieving more, it was about being human. As days passed, John Stone found himself immersed in an unfamiliar, yet undeniable transformation. His business empire, which once consumed his every waking hour, no longer held the same grip on him. His days began to feel lighter, as if he had discovered a new dimension of life he had long neglected. It started with the small changes, the moments when John would pause to listen to his employees or offer a few words of encouragement. At first, these actions felt awkward. But over time, they became more natural, as if his heart was slowly opening to the very things he had once dismissed as distractions. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was becoming a human being again. His perspective on success shifted. For years, John had equated wealth with fulfillment, believing that if he accumulated enough money, power, and status, he would find happiness. But now, he could see that these things, though important, were not the source of true contentment. True fulfillment, he realized, came from something deeper. It came from connection. It came from the simple act of being present with others. John began volunteering at local shelters during his lunch breaks. It wasn't grandiose or publicized, just a quiet gesture, a way for him to connect with people outside his world of high-powered meetings and corporate jargon. At first, the experience was humbling. He saw people who had nothing, yet their sense of community and warmth was something he hadn't felt in years. He spent time talking with the homeless, listening to their stories, offering a few words of encouragement. He began to understand that wealth didn't define a person's worth. Their kindness, their capacity for love, and their ability to hold on to hope despite their circumstances, those were the things that mattered. One afternoon, as John sat with a group of people at a shelter, a realization hit him like a wave. He had spent decades chasing the wrong things, measuring his success by the size of his bank account and the number of zeros on his paycheck. But true success wasn't about how much you had, it was about how much you gave, how deeply you connected with others, and how you made a difference in their lives. At work, John began implementing changes in his business practices that reflected this new perspective. He shifted the focus of his company from pure profits to a more holistic approach, one that valued ethical practices, sustainability, and employee well-being. He opened up dialogues with his employees, inviting them to share their thoughts on how to make the company a better place to work. The transformation wasn't just internal, it was now external, too. The more he focused on people, whether it was his employees, clients, or those less fortunate, the more he realized how much he had been missing. Success, he understood now, wasn't about accumulating wealth. It was about cultivating relationships, giving back, and living with purpose. John's heart felt fuller than it ever had before, not because he had more, but because he was giving more. And all of it, he knew, had started with a single moment, a beggar, a coin, and the quiet, steady eyes that had offered him a gift of perspective he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Months had passed since John Stone had received the worn coin from the beggar. The simple, unassuming act had set off a ripple of change in his life, and now, as he stood in the conference room of his company, John couldn't help but feel the weight of everything he had learned. His business, once a symbol of his relentless pursuit of success, had evolved into something more meaningful, something that focused not only on profits but also on people. Yet, as much as he had changed, something inside him told him that the beggar's role in his life wasn't yet fully understood. One quiet evening, long after the workday was over, John decided to take a walk. The city felt different now. Less like a place to conquer and more like a space to observe and connect. As he walked through the same downtown street where he had met the beggar months earlier, a strange sense of déjà vu hit him. The bustling crowd, the sounds of the city, and the energy all felt eerily familiar, yet it was no longer the same. And then, as he rounded the corner, he saw him. The same beggar, sitting on the same curb. His clothes were still ragged, and his eyes still held that same deep, knowing calm. This time, John didn't stop. He didn't feel the need to offer money or drop a coin into his cup. Instead, he approached the beggar with a different energy, a quiet respect that was new to him. The beggar looked up as John approached, his eyes meeting his with a knowing smile. There was no judgment, no expectation, just a calm acknowledgement, as though this moment had been waiting for him all along. "Hello again," John said softly. The beggar didn't answer with words, but his presence spoke volumes. John sat down beside him on the curb, feeling oddly at peace in the beggar's company. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. But the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It felt grounding, like two people who had shared something profound, though they had never spoken it out loud. Finally, John spoke, the question he had carried with him for so long rising to his lips. "What was that all about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That coin, that moment. Why did you give it to me?" The beggar smiled again, his eyes softening with understanding. "I gave you the coin, not because you needed it, but because you needed to see it." His voice was steady, but there was a depth to it that made John pause. You were lost in your success, chasing things that didn't truly matter. The coin was a symbol, something simple, something small, yet something that could shift your perspective if you were ready to see it. You've done the work, John. You've opened yourself up. The coin was just the beginning. John sat in silence, the words washing over him. He had spent so many years focused on the wrong things, measuring his life by wealth, status, and power. But now, he realized, the beggar had been a catalyst for his change. Not by giving him the coin, but by offering him the opportunity to look deeper, into himself and into what truly mattered. "Thank you," John whispered, though he knew words could never fully convey the depth of his gratitude. The beggar simply nodded, as if he understood. And with that, John stood up, the coin still in his pocket, but with a heart that felt lighter than it ever had before. John Stone's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The pursuit of wealth and status that had once consumed him now seemed trivial in comparison to the deeper fulfillment he had discovered. His world no longer revolved around numbers, profits, or power. It was centered on people, connection, and purpose. He had transformed from a driven businessman, isolated in his achievements, to someone who genuinely cared about the well-being of those around him. His company flourished not only because of its ethical practices and sustainable initiatives, but also because of the energy he had poured into it, not just as a CEO, but as a person who valued each individual's contribution. Employees who once worked in the shadows now felt seen and heard. The culture in the company had shifted from one of efficiency to one of collaboration and empathy. Beyond his business, John had found new purpose in giving back. He continued to volunteer at local shelters, offering more than just his time, he offered his heart. Every interaction, every smile, and every shared moment reminded him of what truly mattered in life. It was no longer about what he had, but about what he could offer. As John walked the streets of the city where everything had changed, he smiled to himself. The beggar, the coin, the quiet lesson, he realized now that it wasn't just the coin that had changed his life, but the moment of reflection it had triggered. In the simplest of exchanges, he had found the meaning he'd been searching for all along. Life was about connection, not accumulation. John had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had found a new kind of wealth, the kind that couldn't be measured in money,